Welcome to Solomoriah Speaks, Episode 3, An Impossible Review. Today I've decided to do a review of a game product that I feel very strongly about. The basic fantasy role-playing game. Now, at this point, if you know me, you know anything about me, and you know anything about the basic fantasy role-playing game, you'll know that I'm the fellow who wrote it. Or at least responsible for getting it written. I wrote more than half of the book. I had a lot of collaborators. The credits on the page is thick with people, but it's primarily my project. And so you're thinking, if it's mine, how can I possibly review it? And you'd be right, more or less. A reviewer has two jobs to do. The reviewer's job, of course, is to tell you about the product and to tell you if they liked it. So inevitably I'm biased. Of course I'm going to tell you that I like it. I think it's fantastic and wonderful and all the great things in the world. But that doesn't mean I can't tell you about the game, tell you some things that I think are important, that I think often get overlooked by other reviewers or misunderstood because they're not coming from the background that I was coming from when I wrote it. The number one thing that I hear about basic fantasy in reviews or in comments on reviews that really bothers me is the description of basic fantasy as a sort of a light version of the D20 system. I don't believe it could be further from the truth. Yes, right here on the first numbered page of the book it says, the basic fantasy role-playing game is a rules-light game system based on the D20 SRD 3.5. but heavily rewritten with inspiration from early role-playing game systems. As far as I know, every OSR, old school Renaissance, retro clone, or simulacrum game, whatever terminology you want to use, everyone that I know of uses the open game license. We all do. We use the open game license, and we use the D20 3.5 or possibly 3.0, but probably 3.5 SRD as our basis. Not necessarily that we're starting from those rules, but rather we're using those rules as a legal basis in order to gain access to terminology, ideas and features that otherwise wizards might claim we stole from them and send us cease and desist letters or actually come after us in court. The open game license gives people the ability to create compatible works. And compatible is a pretty broad term. Let's just put it that way. Basic Fantasy RPG is the game the way we played it, more or less, in the 1980s. And when I say we, I very specifically mean my friends in my group, the people that I played role-playing games with. There is one exception. That one exception is Ascending Armor Class. It's the one thing that everyone points at and says, see, it's D20. It has Ascending AC. I'll tell you right now the same thing I have said many times in many places online. If I had thought of Ascending AC back in the 80s, I'd have used it then. I am slow looking things up on tables. I find it inconvenient. And I don't like the mathematics involved in the THACO system, if that's even how you pronounce it. I don't like doing subtraction in my head. I'm slow. I'm sorry. I'm not a great mathematician. I am adequate at adding numbers. And the wonderful thing about an ascending AC system is most of the time you just have to add numbers. It's pretty efficient that way. And as a game master, having to look up the different numbers needed to hit for different monsters for every single attack, or almost anyway, was very time consuming. It slowed the game down. I didn't want the game to be slowed down, and it slowed the game down. Switching to an ascending AC system and an attack bonus system suited me very well. One of the games I played back in the 80s that wasn't the world's most popular role-playing game actually used an attack bonus type system. They called it combat rating. And that system was more efficient. It was quicker. The combats moved quicker. But they didn't really use armor class per se. Their armor worked differently, so it wasn't really a direct comparison. when I came back to in the early 2000s, when I came back to the traditional old school games that I loved, that was one of the first things I remember that I didn't love. So, as I say, I would have changed that. I would have done it. I would have used ascending AC then if I'd had the option. Now, hang on a moment. I don't really need that thing on right now. Where was I? Okay, so Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Game is old school. It is as close as I felt I could get at the time that I wrote it, around 2006, 2007, to the way we played back in the 80s. Since then, other games have come along that have gotten closer to that experience. I did make some changes that I was rather happy with. Race and class are not the same thing. The game that I was thinking of, the game that I remember playing, had dwarves that were just dwarves. They weren't dwarf fighters or dwarf thieves or anything like that. They were just dwarves. They call that race classes, if you're not familiar with the concept. I didn't like that. In particular, after I came to understand more of the whole genre, the fact that halflings couldn't really be thieves didn't set well with me. So as I say, no race classes. All the other changes are pretty minor in my opinion. I do provide some optional rules and some rules that aren't exactly optional but are different. Probably the most obvious thing is that I didn't ever really like the way energy drain worked in the old game. Didn't really like the way energy drain worked in the old game, so I came along and used a negative level system that is somewhat modern, I suppose. Not because I felt strongly about it, but rather just because the paperwork involved was inconvenient. I didn't like it. So I came up with an alternative system that I think works more than adequately and doesn't involve nearly as much paperwork or bookkeeping. The game system is as complete as it can reasonably be made within the span of 160 odd pages. Let's see, the last numbered page is 166, so it's not quite 170 pages total. All the standard 4 races and 4 classes. A supply of regular equipment that is a little more comprehensive than what was in the old game, but not a lot. But we have a book called the Equipment Emporium, available on the website or in print, that has a lot of detailed equipment if you're into that kind of thing. We have a spell section including spells for clerics and magic users that is adequately comprehensive. Section on wilderness adventures and dungeon adventures. An entire section, of course, on combat, the encounter section, including the all-important things like clerics versus undead and so forth, turning the undead. And we have a fairly good collection of monsters. The basic fantasy rules include some either the actual monster or some kind of replacement for every monster that was in that original game from the early 1980s that I was thinking of when I wrote it. In addition, in certain categories of monsters, I brought along some other creatures from other versions or renditions of the game. For example, the golem section is more comprehensive. I also added a few monsters that I needed for the earliest adventures, the adventures in the BF1 Morgansford book. For one thing, I needed more plant monsters for a garden. Those monsters made it right into the core rules. The hangman tree, for example, and the blood rose made it into here. But the monster section, while more than adequate for many adventures, we have more monsters. We have the Basic Fantasy Field Guides, Field Guide series. Volume 1 is in print, Volume 2 is close, Volume 3 is quite a ways away from being ready to print. but it's still being worked on. The main thing holding back Volume 2 is the fact that artwork keeps pouring in. Well, trickling anyway. And every time I get a new piece of artwork, we get a new piece of artwork in there, we do a new edit, we set the clock back. But one of the things that the Basic Fantasy Project has never done is to set a deadline. Even my most fervent wishes are never more than a hope. We just don't do deadlines. It's not what we do. Treasure. Standard treasure tables with all the various types of treasures lettered, much as in the old days. Treasure distributions have been tweaked and adjusted, but they should seem fairly familiar to anyone who sets out to generate a treasure with this system. A nice collection of magic items, not extensive, but good. Encounter tables, including the primary monsters from the game. And one thing the original game didn't have, we have instructions, we have rules for magical research that were absent in the classic game. And we also have some stronghold construction rules that are more detailed than what was provided in the old game. One of the things that I'm always just kind of surprised by, and maybe I might blush just a little bit, and that I'm not going to do in this review, but that other reviewers sometimes do, is read the entire back cover of the rule book. I wrote those words, and I am gratified every time someone reads the whole thing, and they do sometimes, the whole thing on YouTube. This is old school. That's the most important part. That is the one thing I put on the back of this book that really mattered to me. But one of the things that gets the most comments is the other heading, don't buy this book. I put that on there, even though realistically very few people are going to see the back cover of the book before they buy it. I put that on there, and I echo that in the descriptions of the books online in many cases, because everything we have, every single Basic Fantasy product, and this is only a small part of them here, that is available for sale on Amazon or Lulu or DriveThruRPG, every single one of those things is available in PDF and in the original source format on our website at basicfantasy.org. We are a collaborative project. I'm the guy that started it. I'm basically the guy that's in charge of it, but I am absolutely not the only contributor. There are people that I depend on heavily to help get these things done and done right. We have a crack editing team that descends on anything that gets posted in the workshop within days of the items appearing and hammers them into standard layout format. Does an editing pass practically right away. Even things that are never going to be on the track for printing, you get that kind of treatment from our editing team. They must really love editing, and I know they're good at it. James Lemon and Al Vetter are the primary guys who do editing, but lately we've had several other people on the forum who've also been jumping in and helping out. Every single person who contributes is appreciated. We have a number of supplements adding in things like rangers and illusionists and so forth that you might want in your game that weren't part of the original game, but that a lot of people want in their campaigns. We have official and unofficial supplements, as it were, all designed so that the game master can easily use them a la carte. In fact, that's my hope. That a game master starting a Basic Fantasy game and asking for players online somewhere can simply say, I'm running Basic Fantasy. I'm using gnomes, half-humans, magic user options, combat options, illusionists, druids, rangers, and paladins. And stop right there. And that is enough for the players to download the supplements that they need to play their characters, to enjoy the game. Players don't have to buy anything. They can download a PDF of the rules and have everything in digital format and never have to pay a penny. But then again, on Amazon, this is $5. Most anybody who can afford to buy anything can afford to buy a copy of the Basic Fantasy Core Rules. You can buy everything we have in print for the price of many other games' player's book. You can buy everything, all of our adventures, the Equipment Emporium, the Field Guide 1, and the Core Rules. In paperback. and not exceed the cost of one book from other games. And we have hardbacks available. I don't have a hardback of the Basic Fantasy Rules in my office, but I do have a hardback of the first edition. This is the very first one I ever got. The current game is third edition. This is another misconception that I do need to kind of call out. Basic Fantasy RPG is in its third edition and has been for some time now. The distinction between the second edition and the third edition is a small handful of monsters, one magic item, and a number of spelling or grammatical errors. And I think we added the normal man to the saving throw tables. I mean, there is nothing significant in there. If you have second edition rulebooks, you can absolutely buy all of our adventures and use them, and you don't even need the third edition. I'm not even sure that any of those monsters are in any of the adventures. If they are, you can always download a copy of the core rules, third edition, just to look that up. So it's not like it's a big deal. The difference between the first edition and the second, the wrestling rules were rewritten from the ground up. There was actually a dedicated team that worked on the wrestling rules. It was quite an effort. They spent several months. The few people who were interested in doing this all got together, spent several months chasing through those rules, examining every option, with the idea of maintaining the absolute simplicity of the rules while making them usable. I still don't use wrestling rules very much. That's a personal thing, I suppose, or maybe it's my players. I don't know. But that was the key difference between first and second edition. We also changed the way maneuverability works. If you use the maneuverability rule, maneuverability is easier to understand in the second edition than it was in the first. It works the same way. The rules didn't change, but the way we write it down and explain it did. And that's it. I mean, there is very little difference between the first and second edition, very little difference between the second and third. It's not like a certain modern game I can think of where each new edition is a completely different game. We don't do that. Basic fantasy rules are basically the same as they were in 2006. We cleaned them up a lot. There have been a lot of iterations through that. We've fixed a few peripheral things because realistically, maneuverability isn't used very often. Wrestling isn't used very often. The Stronghold rules were rewritten between the first and second edition. They're not a huge, important part of the game. Certainly they don't affect every game every time. Adding normal men to the saving throw tables didn't really make much difference. It's all pretty compatible. That was the idea. We already knew what we wanted. We already had a system in mind, the system we played. And this we is more expansive we, including the contributors who contributed to the game. They all kind of understood the same thing I did. Kind of came from the same place I did. Maybe they didn't play the game exactly the same way, but we all understood each other, and we worked together to make a game that would bring back memories. I am gratified. I am pleased every time I find somebody who's never played the old games who's playing Basic Fantasy and enjoying it. I love that. I love to hear that. I know my comments about people misunderstanding where the game is coming from may sound like a complaint, but it is not. I just want people to know how this works, how it actually came to be. But if you're a young player, and by young I mean anything under 40 because I'm in my 50s. If you're a younger player who didn't have those experiences, but you're having them now with Basic Fantasy, great. I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad you're enjoying it. So yeah, as a review, this probably sucked. It's kind of a sales pitch, except I'm not really trying to sell you anything. More like I'm trying to explain to people who may already be sold or partly sold on the game to help them understand where it's coming from and where it's going, which as far as the rulebook goes is nowhere. I don't have any plans for a 4th edition. I do have a few edits in the pipeline that I may eventually get into a new release number, but it'll still be 3rd edition. On the other hand, we have new adventures, new materials coming out all the time. Like I said, we have Field Guide 1's in print. Field Guide 2 is close. Field Guide 3 is probably a ways off yet. But all of those will eventually be available in print if you want them. We have 2 complete adventures that are on the downloads page that are not yet finished enough to get into print. Stephen Pogue's SP1, The Endless Tunnels of Landon, which I personally love and am playtesting right now. And Kyle Hettinger's The Black Apple Brew. I had to look that word up, B-R-U-G-H, it's Scottish. The Black Apple Brew, which is a quirky, interesting adventure. I really enjoyed reading through it. I'm looking forward to having an opportunity to play test it with my players. But that's a ways off. I've got some other stuff in the process right now. We have the whole BF series, BF1 Morgan's Fort, BF2 Fortress Tomb and Tower, and BF3 Strongholds of Sorcery, which are all basically adventures of mine. I didn't write all of them, but they are adventures from my campaign worlds. And the JN series, J.D. Neal's adventures. JN1 The Chaotic Cave is a starting area, a little village, and some monsters nearby, with a bonus dungeon adventure, manor actually, abandoned manor, that is towards the end of the adventure. JN2 Monkey Isle. I don't think I need to explain that one. Giant apes on an island, and dinosaurs, and other weirdness. It's pretty cool. And JN3 Saga of the Giants, which is as thick as the core rules. It is a monster adventure. All of those adventures, pretty much all the ones I just listed, may be considered homages in one fashion or another to the adventures of the old days, but don't expect any of them, even Saga of the Giants, to be a straight up copy. Number one, that would be plagiarism, and number two, it'd be boring. The adventures end differently, they progress differently. There are plenty of red herrings. It may look like to the players at some point that they may be kind of like copies, pastiches maybe. But they are different. They are definitely different adventures. DC1, Tales from the Laughing Dragon. Dave Gerard's adventure series set in the Dragonclaw Barony is a popular one. We now have adventure anthology series AA1 and AA2 in print, and AA3 is been cut off. I got all the adventures in it that we plan to have in it. AA1 and AA2, the Adventure Anthology series, are collections of short adventures that you can use in your game, varying levels, but typically lower to middle level adventures. And then there's the contest series, CS1 and CS2. CS1, Castle by the Sea, and CS2, The Dark Temple. Both of those were contests we ran on our website for people to create keys where the dungeon maps were provided, and in the case of the Dark Temple, a writing prompt. A temple, ancient and crumbling, haunted by some eldritch horror. That was it. That's the writing prompt. Plus the maps of the dungeon. Both are small. There are only 22 numbered areas in Castle by the Sea. Dark Temple's a little bigger. They are meant to be able to be finished in 1 or 2 sessions. Castle by the Sea can almost always, all 6 of the adventures, different adventures for the same map in the Castle by the Sea book, all of them can be finished in 4 hours by competent players who stay on task. Stay on task is the problem for the players more than being competent. I love them. I love all of them. I've run most of the adventures I just listed. I have not run DC1, Tales from the Laughing Dragon. I do want to do that someday. And of course I haven't run the Black Apple Brew. It's very new. But that's where we're at. That's where the project is at. So this has been a review of the rules that became a discussion of the project status. Thanks for joining me today. I don't know when I'll have another video. I'm not even sure I have a video now, but we'll see. Thank you for joining me. Bye.